Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be here, to see everyone and see also lots of people online. That's very exciting too. Okay, so as Jamie has said, I'm not a social policy or population or psychology, for that matter, person. So I'll be talking to you from a fairly different perspective. So please shout at me if you need me to, stop talking, or if you need me to talk more about particular aspects. But to show, oh, I should probably figure out how to move back here. There we go. Yes, to give you a sense of where I come from. I have a bit of a weird background where I've been spanning psychology and sociology as one double major, and then theoretical computer science as the other, because it was in Central Europe, and you could just do both of those things at the same time and not be bored. And then I ended up doing human-computer interaction. So what that means is it's a weird discipline that just, appeared when technology appeared, which is not very long time ago. And that essentially combines lots of things that have to do with people and technologies and design, and I'll talk about that a little more. So just for me to get a sense, who here has experience with user-centered design? One, okay. Who knows the word user-centered design? Okay, perfect. And who has heard the word human-computer interaction? Okay. Oh, lots of people. Excellent. So I'll probably breeze through this really quickly, but out of curiosity, I put a human-computer interaction researcher working on mental health interventions, right? And ChatGPT kept on throwing stuff like this. Really weird tech, usually very blue, very modern lab monitors that don't exist, right? And then I went off and did a search on what is the definition of my own discipline, which seems to be, we're focusing in the design and use of digital technology, which focuses on the interfaces between people and digital systems. So HCI researchers observes the ways that humans interact with technology, but also design technologies that allow humans to interact. Now, I shifted and say that now it's not computers, it's digital technologies, because you just have computers permeate everywhere. And it's also about understanding how humans interact with other humans through these digital devices. So that's the interesting part. And obviously the question is, well, how does that apply to interventions? Because, it's just interactions. And for here, I wanted to just really orient you to how designers see the world, or how human-computer interaction people who happen mostly to be designers or interaction designers see the world, where the idea is that anything is technology of some sort. And, you're essentially looking at how do people engage with the world and how do they interpret it and how they think about it. So this is a technology design, right? It's not a particularly good one. If you're driving along with your car up here and you have 3 seconds to figure out if you can stop here on Tuesday afternoon, this is a really bad design. This is another version of a design which delivers the same information. So essentially enables the same interaction, same experience for a user, but in a way that's much easier to understand, right? Okay, so when we talk about design and interaction design, even if you're thinking about interventions, this is what's happening. You're always thinking about how do you shape people's experience with the world and in the world. The other part that I really care about is socio-technical design, which is essentially just a fancy word of saying, well, what happens when people actually use technologies? You design them for one purpose, and then you hand your iPad to an elderly relative and they use it as a cutting board, right? Mm-hmm. It's a useful way of using the technology. So when you think about socio-technical design, you're saying, well, okay, this spray seems like a great idea. You have oil, you spray it into the pan, it's amazing. The moment when you notice this being in the same house, it becomes a terrible idea. That's socio-technical design, right? It's thinking about the unintended consequences. I think this is closer to interventions, right? I have a brilliant idea. I'll just get all kids not to use drugs by giving them pencils. Now, what happens when you get kids to use those pencils? Again, this is design. This is what you're thinking about when you're trying to design stuff. So for us, it's the notion of using user-centered design is really thinking about how do you design for people using specific technologies to undertake specific activities in contexts. And what this means is there's so much uncertainty that and also your technology keeps on changing every 7 years, as I like to say. So it's not really science, it's engineering, right? So you're not really trying to get to the true nature of engaging with a pencil. You're trying to figure out a problem and then find a way of getting through to that problem, ideally relying on science, but not pretending that HCI is one. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So with this framing, what I want to talk about today is how we ended, how we're taking this approach and using it in this context of mental health interventions and something we call situated mental health interventions. And I'll be trying to make or talk about three assertions of three statements that kind of drive a lot of the work in that fellowship and in a number of other projects that we're starting to work with. And the first one's a little provocative, right? And so it's saying that there's a lot of baked in assumptions about what can or cannot be done that are kind of now reified in intervention design, perhaps because they're reified assumptions about what was possible at the point when those interventions were designed, right? And we'll talk a bit more about that too. Then the second one is that I'm saying that the user-centered design, if you do identify these assumptions, user-centered design is a really interesting way of questioning some of these assumptions. So asking, okay, if we don't believe this is true anymore, how could we fix it while keeping the psychology efficacy in, but potentially really redesigning the interactions that people have with the idea of the intervention? And then finally, it seems to be a fairly broad design approach that can be used in a number of places, and we'll talk about that really briefly. So the idea is that I'll whiz through a large number of slides, and I'll whiz through them really quickly because I didn't quite understand or know which parts of this you'll be really interested in. And then we can jump back in questions to any other pieces, and I have other presentations that kind of go deeper into specific aspects of this. So I want to start by just talking about the fellowship and talking about the key ideas that are underpinning that fellowship and what is it that we do. Then I want to talk about this Purple thing, which is something that fell out of my postdoc fellowship, and then a nonprofit in the US has taken it up and turned it into something like this, and now it's being used in a bunch of places. So it's a nice example of go from an idea of an entirely different intervention all the way down to actual product and seeing how it works. And then I want to talk a little bit about some ongoing projects. So the fellowship's kind of halfway through. I'm really excited about the extension now being formal, and that extension also meaning that I hopefully will get to work a little bit more with Jamie and Francis, and I'd love to work with people in this department too. So just to give you a sense of what are the kinds of things that we're looking for as we're running away from Purple as quickly as we can. All right. So what do I mean about these baked-in historical assumptions? It's essentially just the best way that I could figure out where we're saying we do think that there can be some substantial changes in how you deliver interventions, but we don't claim that we're more intelligent or clever or like amazing than all the psychologists who have looked at the interventions. We're just saying, okay, we're questioning things that haven't been questioned for some time. And that's the only secret sauce. So what does this mean? If you think back to how we've talked about the interaction design, everything's really user-centered, right? So it's less about you start from theory and then you try and apply it to user. It's about, well, let's think about what the process is, what the theory of change is actually for the user, and then look at the places where they face the most challenge, and then look at why they face those challenges, and then see what happens. So because we work in mental health, I kind of have this little sketch that I think some people like David Moore would marginally kill me for, but not quite. And it's just trying to say, in a traditional intervention, if you go to a therapy session, CBT session or something else, what would you likely expect? So you get some information from the therapist, you gain an insight with therapist help, you role play with the therapist because, that's a good way of trying skills out. You get some homework to do, which you might or might not do, and then you practice and apply it in daily life, and you reflect and learn, and then you go back to the therapist the next week, and you kind of keep on going, and then eventually you win or you don't, depending on you and the therapy and how well it's gone. But there's the least amount of support that actually is available when you think about how deeply people thought about the supporting people through all these individual steps. That happens in the practice, daily life, and reflection, right? And it makes total sense because in 60s, when these therapies or these models were designed, there was nothing that people could do, perhaps phone you, but there was nothing that you could be offering as support in those places. Now, what's more interesting is when you look at how a digital CBT looks like, it's often very similar, right? So there's some psychoeducation, there's some insight, whether you do it on your own or on a call. There's not that much role play because you don't actually get to be with the therapist. And then there's some no homework that's a little more pushy. And then again, like there's very little support on you actually trying to apply those skills. Does that make sense? Okay, so all of the fellowship essentially said, okay, great, there's so much good stuff happening in the other places of the therapy. Let's look at why this is not happening here. And then let's say if we assume that the limited support is because people just didn't have the technologies, do we have any technologies now that would allow us to do this, to deliver technology-enabled approaches that guide people's experiences? So the technology is not the key. The technology is just a catalyst to guide people's experiences and provide ongoing contextualized support, which is directly embedded into the daily moments when protective competencies are being used. And all of that is essentially a different way of saying, hey, we think that there's a bunch of assumptions about we can't support people in these moments. That might no longer be true. Let's figure out what would that mean. Yep. Okay. So I won't go to this, but a key part of the fellowship and the general approach that we have was that one of the reasons why people haven't done this yet is that to be able to do this, you kind of need to span all these three different places. You need to understand design and technology and be able to like think out of the box and build stuff that doesn't exist. You need to really deeply understand the mechanisms of psychology interventions because you really want to be able to take a CBT and unpack it not to what the modules say, but actually what it's trying to do to the person or with the person in their head. What is the experience you're trying to generate for them? And then also you have to do the socio-technical design piece, which is about all of a sudden in therapy, you create this world where in the room, the therapist has control and the patient comes in and is part of that therapy universe, right? Now, if you're thinking about supporting people outside of that, all of a sudden you have to deal with the fact that you're designing for a world that they own and that it needs to fit in with what they're doing with their children, with their families, and so on. So the socio-technical design is really important, and we want to avoid the little like do drugs pencil effects. Okay, this is all of the work that I'm talking about is mostly due to all these lovely people, Jess and Sarai being postdocs, and Nikki, Phoebe, Melina, PhD students, as well as a large number of collaborators all over. So I think I didn't list everyone on each slide, but I deeply, truly appreciate everyone's work on this, and it wouldn't have been really possible at all without it. A key piece of it is that most of these collaborators are not HCI people. So these are clinicians. These might be people who really deeply understand one of the psychological aspects that we're looking for. And essentially they're there to tell me that I'm doing total silly things and like how to actually apply design to things that make sense. All right, so with this as the fellowship overview, I wanted to jump into an example of what do we mean that we can create fundamentally different mechanisms. And I think the key part here is that user-centered design is going to be really, really bad at building new psychological models of change, right? If you think in terms of a psychological model of change is the set of brain mechanisms or understanding of brain mechanisms that will lead to something. Even the goals are not for HCI to decide. But what it can do as fundamentally different mechanisms is just the way in which a therapy, in which that experience is delivered to people and enabled for people. And I really want to, all of that is going to be about, well, how do we get to zero to Purple now being used in an eating disorders NHS clinic? And in some sense, this is the design approach, right? So if we're trying our design brief was that if we're trying to support situated skills development, which we said, or we believed was an assumption that isn't really necessary anymore. So like that we can't do this. We're saying we probably could. The idea for us was that we're targeting something specific that we can learn about from psychology. That's the target skill development through experiential learning, right? So those were our bets on what the psychological mechanisms that we want to support are. The clear path to eventual implementation was we don't want to assume that everyone has to buy a £4,000 Apple Vision Pro because we really love cool technology, but also we don't care about this being immediately deployed across the whole NHS because you face a whole lot of implementation science barriers that you don't want when you're actually trying to figure out something entirely new. So there's a purpose and benefit from stepping out from the implementation science system when you're trying to figure out what a new idea would be, while always keeping an eye on if this were to be successful, is there any belief that this could actually trickle down into an implementation science? So this is my very detailed and scientific graph of what we mean. We're kind of not on the cutting edge of technology innovation. We're not the people who are building new sensors, but also we're not all the way down in real impact, right? So our happy place is kind of playing with technology that is reasonably stable, but it hasn't actually really been deployed at that scale yet. And then use all those collaborations with clinicians and implementation science people to eventually take the innovations we might have all the way down to implementation because we care about it, but we don't design in the implementation systems. Does it make sense? Cool. All right, so quickly, and now we're getting to the user-centered design. Now we're getting to what is it that actually we've done. So how do we get from Peter has a bad idea and then persuades Austrian government to give him money to Purple to like it being seen as potentially not dreadful. So this is work that's been based on social emotional learning programs, which I know that you all are so much better acquainted with than I am. But the idea that we've noticed through a bunch of papers that I did during my PhD was that in prevention science, in these kind of school-based programs, you kind of assume that if you're trying to deliver a social emotional skill, emotion regulation in our case, to children, you kind of require in-class didactic learning if you're going through schools, and that it often needs to be a Dell lab. So you don't get a bunch of kids in the room and say, hey guys, what do you think would be a great idea to learn how to regulate their emotions? How about you teach your teacher to do this? Right. So there's this idea that you might take the way to support emotion regulation is to go and train a trainer, to go and train another trainer in a school, and who trains the teachers, and then those teachers tell something to the kids and send home a message that says, okay, dear parent, next time your child has issues, tell them to breathe or tell them to do something simple. Now we were saying, well, okay, what would happen if these things weren't true anymore? If we could build something that's child-led and requires no training at all, what would it mean to build an intervention that's very much centered on the child in the moment of having an emotional dysregulation? How would we go about it? Now, so yeah, how can we design and support child-led emotion regulation? And the idea was that, okay, apply for funding, potentially get funding, build a weird potato, really fell in love with the null thing, build a couple of units, send them out, figure out that they don't work, make them again. And then like this was totally not the plan. The fact of a US nonprofit taking up the idea and pouring 2 million into it and turning it into a factory line in China, not quite what we've written into the proposal. Oh yeah, and then some other stuff. I think what's really interesting is I think 100,000 people bought this thing on Amazon by now, and that's like last year's summer results, and it still has high ratings, meaning that people who paid 50, 60 bucks for this find it helpful, which is weirdly interesting, right? Because it's not a very vocal toy, right? It's not some. It suggests that it has some benefits to them, whether or not those are actual significant benefits is different. But it seems to say people find it interesting and useful. Okay, and I did want to do a shout out. So in as much as I'm maybe a grandfather of Purple's soul of how it interacts and what it does, Catherine Ispista is the grandmother, the fairy godmother of Purple in terms of how it's actually being made and prototype. So if you're interested in purple design, I can talk about it more in the questions, like in the details of what it does and why it does. There are two papers that we have as well. One of them is very HCI, so it was about, here's a problem. How do we support emotion regulation in low-income families? What would we even think about in terms of bringing technology into these contexts? What the idea is. And then the second one from Catherine is post hoc, once all this process has finished, how did we get, like, what is the design process of moving from a prototype to an actually fully fledged product? And how do we get to these? So quickly breathing through the user-centered design process, and it seems like some of you have heard about it, so we can get back to individual places. But what did we do with Purple? And remember, I was a postdoc, so I had about £3,000 in research expenses that were available to me and my time, and that was about it. And then I persuaded a nonprofit to give me $30,000 or $40,000. So we had a little bit of support, but very, very small numbers at that point, student-y project. So we went and talked to experts, and we did a bunch of lit review to understand what is the psychology basis for this, and the fact that no one's really looked at this before. Then we and talked to about 20 to 25 families that live in Rose Hill, so like the lowest socioeconomic demographic we could find in Oxford, more or less. And I volunteered at the community center, and we then engaged with that community and talked to families. And the idea that came out of it was that kids are already expected to emotion regulate. So there were stories, and the themes were around, all right, if my child's being stroppy, I'll just tell them to go to their room. They probably sit on their bed and cry, and they're not allowed to come down until they, are a human again. And we were saying, okay, this is fascinating, because like this is clearly the place to design. A child's being sent into somewhere else with no support, trying to do the emotion regulation that they don't have any knowledge of, and their parents don't really do anything else than what they're asking their child to do. How would we approach that? And then we did a bunch of co-design work with kids, with families, with clinicians, but then a lot of like, oh, I wonder if I combine all these pieces together, what could a solution be, right? There's no way in which you could run a deep, rigorous research on every single decision you're making, because you're making about a few thousand of those decisions. Then we built something, and we assumed that it's going to fail. We deployed it. It really didn't. So this is not a traditional design process. There should be like a big iteration of, you build something, you deploy it, it fails miserably, you go and build it again. And you try and do this as quickly as you can. And then, what you're trying to do is this double diamond design process, which I think is really interesting as a mental model. Have you heard this? Have you seen this before? Okay, so the idea there is that if you're designing something entirely new, there are two phases. One of these is you need to figure out what is it that you're even designing for. So you're trying to get a sense of, okay, we're designing for kids, we know this, we're designing for emotion regulation, we know that too, but what is the outcome? Like, how will we know, what is it that we're even trying to get the design right for? So there's this first phase, which has been the phase of go and talk to families, understand that we're designing for a child in their room who've been told to emotion regulate, and they don't know how to do it. What is it that we could support them with? That's the first design, right? Now we have a problem that is actually a design problem we can start addressing. And then the second part is more of probably what you would be more acquainted with, which is, okay, now I have a problem. I need to think about what the outcome measures would be, what are the theories that we bring in, and so on. So that's the second part. Yeah, that's the double diamond. So the idea is you really try and get a broad understanding of what the problems could be. Then you try and figure out what are actually the problems that are important for your population. And your population might be, the low income area parents. It's not necessarily the clinicians who are telling you what they want the low income area parents to do, but they're informing your understanding of how you how you pick and emphasize which parts of the experience that the low-income parents have, you choose to emphasize. And then the second one is you diverge and you build up a lots of different solutions to the problem that you've now defined quite neatly. And then you start in figuring out which of those solutions actually address the problem. And usually, this is why I have this squiggle, like it seems so nice and neat, but usually this is how the design process looks like, right? It's a mess of you essentially continuously making bets. And I think the mental model I kind of try and put across whenever I speak with clinicians is, in this kind of design, you never try to be right because you never will be right. All you're doing is you're trying to reduce the chance of being wrong. So all studies you run are not to give you final answer, but are to give you additional information that you're slightly better at making bets down the line, which is an interesting and kind of freeing approach. So what I wanted to kind of point are these little pieces of the design. Kind of what happened at each of those phases, right? So as we were trying to define the problem, we might have something like, okay, we need something that feels anxious, is vulnerable, is child-oriented, it's something that they can take care of, and they're supposed to care for. It's magical, it's elusive, it's soothing, it's a pet, right? It's nothing about support this psychological efficacy piece. It's really about how will this be experienced by kids? And then you hope that by doing this, it becomes a pleasurable experience, it's self-initiated, it's a resource that people discover, and that it helps them resolve uncomfortable feelings, right? So it allows them to downregulate. So you really define the problem in terms of the user experience, and then you use psychology to say, well, okay, if I want to help them resolve uncomfortable feelings, what is the psychology, science framework that I use? What are the mechanisms? How do I hack their brain to actually do this kind of work, right? So you also play around, right? So we had these mood boards of what do we mean by anxious, vulnerable, something to care for? Well, clearly not this. These were examples of the things that could be right, but they're actually not. But what we meant was a little more like this, right? So this was before we even had an idea of it's going to be a plushy toy and it's going to be purple. It's all about how do you want this to be experienced? What is the trajectory? Essentially was the therapy experience, the same amount of care that goes into setting up chairs in a therapy room, right? Which is a much more controlled experience. This is what's happening here around emotional experiences and thinking through the design. So then we said, through a lot of work that I can talk through during questions, we said, well, okay, we will have something that's physical, that relies very much on just haptic communication, because we know from psychology that if something talks to you, you can do lots of things while people are talking. But if you're trying to focus on haptics, it's really important. So a lot of the psychology pieces that we were bringing in were around, we need to use the theories that already exist around Zen-like, mindful, focused interactions that are physical, right? There's lots of objects that work this way. And then we said, well, okay, the anxiousness is communicated by heartbeat. So if you hold it eventually, you'll notice that it has a heartbeat that's fairly fast to start with, but if you're being nice to it, it slowly calms down, right? And that notion of there's an interactive loop and it forces you to focus on it, that was a key part of this. And it's physical and it's interesting and it can't be too obvious game loop. And I can talk about all those choices, right? And then underpinning it is, well, actually, here's James Gross's fundamental emotion regulation theory about how does neurologically emotion regulation happen? And the idea is that by using haptics, by using this loop, by orienting your attention towards something that feels and that you're projecting on as anxious, you're redeploying attention, which we know is a really good constructive strategy away from rumination. And you're using the same kind of models of response modulation as if you're cuddling with a mum or a pet or something like this. So again, through this, we know what experience we want to engender for kids. So what does the psychology, like how do we fill that experience with psychological theory that would make it work? The idea was that we're building an in-the-moment intervention that's soothing through this attention deployment and response modulation, where the idea is that through repeated engagements, you start feeling to be a little more in control of your emotions. You might start to learn how to deal with your emotions, but most importantly, it becomes a new narrative in the family of what it means to deal with emotions. It's not, Perble's anxious, so let's kick it under the bed and let it come out when it's no longer anxious. It's a thing you're there for someone else. So that notion of Purple to child is the same as child to parent. That has been really strong in how we were thinking about this. And I think this is the key kind of when we're talking about fundamental change of how user-centered design can bring in terms of psychological therapy models. It's not really the theory of change underpinning it, right? It's not the process model or anything like this. Is that notion of instead of telling people what to do and then letting them, try and apply it, we want to build an intervention that is bottom up. So you don't tell kids anything. This is the whole intervention that we did, like a single sheet. You don't tell them anything. It's about you go to Purple when you're anxious, you feel less anxious, you're more likely to go back to it. And through that loop, through those little engagements, you get to something that potentially would work. That was the idea, right? No training needed, single piece. The parents were instructed to say, hey, we found this on the doorstep. We have no idea what it does. Would you take care of it? Bye. That's all. I'm going to run through these really quickly. We built it. Lovely PhD students in Santa Cruz built the actual physical units. We had like 5 of them. They had lithium batteries in them. So like we asked kids not to stab their Purples because they could burn down the house. And we deployed them and we gave kids cameras and little diaries. And we said, hey, this is a thing. Do you want to take care of it? And also keep a diary for your Purple and yourself. And then we'll come back and talk to you about what happened. So we got all these wonderful pictures of kids actually using Purple. Like this is think about the little pencil, right? We're trying to understand what happens when people use it and how do they use it? How do they embed it into their daily practice? Lots of kids slept with it. Lots of kids took it everywhere, did all kinds of activities with it. This one, like we made burgers together, always makes me cringe. And they did things like this, which is no one's asked them to do that, right? And it's amazing. You had parents coming in and saying, oh, it changed the way how my child thinks about emotions. And like when I see this picture, I remember like Johnny was saying, no, mom, stop. Gum doesn't have a seatbelt yet, right? So that all these things that's the most, it's not an RCT, right? But it shows that something's happening and that the experience is being created in particular ways. It's also not an RCT because we had 8 units that needed babysitting, that needed a research assistant to come in every 3 days, exchange the exceedingly dangerous lithium batteries by disemboweling Purple and like plugging them back in and then re-emboweling Purple. And each unit cost like $500 in just the electronics, right? Think about like us coming to NHS and saying, hey, we're going to build this thing. It's utterly not useful. And also it costs so much. But then because we were able to show these effects and because people could feel it and they could see, oh, this is really interesting and novel, then we got very weirdly, it shouldn't have happened, but then we got to this stage of, hey, now stuff's coming out of a back of a truck or a factory or a FedEx shipments where I just ask for 120 units and I get them. Okay, so this is just a really quick whirlwind of what is it that we've done with Purples, right? So we've started with 14 families was the first deployment, 11 families was the second one. We nearly had to stop the study because kids were crying and hiding Purple and didn't want to give it back. So we had to reorient it to say, okay, this is the mummy's away for a week. Are you okay to take care of it for a week and then give it back to mummy when mummy comes and so on? But okay. And then a bit later, when we did have the units and it was no longer pandemic, we thought, well, okay, there's a lot of people who are buying it online who are young adults or youth, and it seems to help them too. So let's have a look at what's happening there. That led us to work with the Oxford Counseling Service to deploy and look at youth anxiety and depression. And we now have 2 RCTs that have finished, and someone at Stanford has analyzed the data. Apparently, in both of those, significant reductions in depression scores for the Oxford University students just by throwing a Purple at them, in contrast to a control group, which I need to write up at some point. And then we started working with self-harming youth because they seem to have been really attracted to this and have been talking about really interesting effects that it's bringing to them, while also running with families along the same model. And then seeing it being taken up by a clinic in the NHS looking at eating disorders, because that seems to be related to the self-harm. And again, it seems to fit into the community. And now place to be working with us to get about 200 units and deploy in schools and all of their counselors. And they would have deployed with every single counselor if we get money enough so that they can have units to do that. So I just want to use this to say, usually HCI design would end here, right? Sometimes people progress to saying, okay, what happens when you actually deploy in the large scale? But usually that's the point where you hand it over to other people, because this part, the RCTs, the deployments, the really understanding what happens, that's no longer HCI, that's pure kind of clinical efficacy piece of it. And then this is implementation science, which is really interesting too, and has a bunch of HCI. But again, it's not the innovation piece, and it's not the user-centered design piece. So in these two places, the user-centered design, here it's used to build stuff. Here it's used to understand how people use things. What does it actually mean when it gets deployed? Here it doesn't really exist because you're measuring efficacy. You know this way better than I do. And here it becomes really important again, because you're trying to understand how do you deal with barriers to employment, but you're no longer designing the thing, you're designing the structures that allow you to deliver the thing. Does that make sense? Okay. Interestingly, like what we found was RCTs are amazing because they essentially create participants for you to do user-centered design on. So I infuriate my lovely colleagues like Ellen and Chris Hollis by saying we're only running an RCT with the 150 self-harming kids because we need participants into our co-design trials, and the control group's easy to add. And we do this because we need the young people to experience Purple so that they can then come to us with that experience and start helping us understand how can we build a package on top of their experience with Purple that would embed ACT DBT style kind of cognitive loads on top of it. But the RCT itself is totally not user-centered design apart from thinking about it. All right, so if we move back to the big picture, the whole idea of the fellowship is we don't do Purple, we do this notion of what does it mean to start thinking about different kinds of interventions that are situated. Purple has been an example for emotion regulation, but there's lots of other mechanisms where we're saying, well, okay, can we do the same thing that we've done for Purple? Can we do it for these kinds of projects? And all of these are things that are already ongoing. And what's interesting is that it seems that the model that we've kind of had to hack together because of building Purple seems to be really interesting and applicable in these places too, right? And one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the work that we might be doing with Jamie, or the work that we're doing with the UW Electricity Center, which is also like a massive implementation science piece, is that it's really interesting to also think about questioning assumptions in interventions that are already scaled up and where the innovation's a little more limited in terms of like how much you can blow up the whole system. But it still is super exciting, and you can probably do a lot of good. Two things that I want to leave you with is the two projects I'm most excited about now, well, apart from others, are one which is looking at parenting interventions, where as a result of a weirdly run RCT with Purple and families, we've stumbled upon this idea of reflective questions. Specific ways of crafting questions seem to be an intervention for parents. So essentially, just by answering a simple question, which seems to take 40 seconds each day, we seem to be able to start shifting parents' perception of parental socialization of emotion, how much they think about their child's emotion, mentalization, and stuff like this. We have no idea if that's actually true, but there's some interesting pilot data that I can talk about. And it's also a really interesting example of using user-centered design on something that's inherently really tiny and super scalable, but also that allows us to play with things like micro RCTs, and Susan Murphy and Petra are the people who've kind of created that methodology. And the other piece is, which we've started over the last 3-4 months, is getting together kind of a Turing Fellow large language model person together with Amy Urban, who I imagine you guys know, and who's looking at youth engagement in social media. And then James Grotz, who's kind of a emotion regulation, wonderful person who's built the whole thing. And thinking about how could we take the theories of emotion regulation and embed them into the ways in which large language models are fine-tuned, and essentially create these cognitive journeys that would enable us to support people's development of emotion regulation capabilities through these new techniques. So that is very much a Perble-like thing where we're building technology that doesn't exist yet, and it might fail, but it's interesting. There's a paper that's coming out in 2 weeks, and I've shared it with Jamie, and I can share it with the group. It's actually online too, which essentially talks about user-centered design in psychological interventions. How are we thinking about it when we've combined the work that I've done with the work that Sean Munson's done, which I think is really interesting. So I'd love to hear what you think if you do end up reading it. And now I just want to wrap up because, as always, I'm over the time limit in just putting these statements back up to say, this is the way that we're thinking about a lot of things, and this is the way that we think makes sense to think about a lot of things in intervention world, as long as people are bringing new technologies in, because new technologies question assumptions, and it might be worth thinking about that. And the last piece that I wanted to throw into the kind of plenum is that Lineker has been really interestingly collaborating with Committee for Children, who's the nonprofit behind Perble, to start this set of junior research fellowships. But the idea is that through having 5 junior research fellows who each work at the intersection, at some parts of the intersection between AI and social, emotional, mental health, education, well-being spaces, we actually want to build a community within Oxford that's kind of bringing people from different departments together, because you need all those connections, but you don't necessarily get them just yet. So if you're interested, come and talk to me about this. And with this, I'll leave it here. Thank you so much.